Cheers, thanks for me. So for my bit, I just wanted to talk a little bit about comparing villains across the texts, especially comparing Iago to Don John in Much Ado About Nothing. The links between the two characters has always been something that I found quite interesting. I used to do a lot with it in a Year 7 Shakespearean villains unit, and I really kind of was able to unpick that with those Year 7s, which was really, really interesting to explore. When it came to Key Stage 5, I found that I was always just expecting students to do it automatically, and that they should just be able to link the different characters that they study at A-level to the ones that we've covered in GCSE and at Key Stage 3. And actually, that only happened with a couple of students, and it made me realise that I need to more explicitly teach those links and kind of scaffold the opportunities to enable students to do that. And after a discussion I had with a colleague this year, I did some really focused work with the Year 13s in terms of developing their Othello knowledge. We cover most of it in Year 12, which I've just mentioned in the chat, but we kind of have that weekly lesson in Year 13. So one of the ones that we did this year, was looking at villains across texts and focusing on that comparison between Iago and Don John. From a cognitive science perspective as well, and obviously, I think some of you, if you've seen the session that I did a few weeks ago on different strategies to make links between texts, we know that making links between different concepts, ideas, and pieces of knowledge strengthens our schema and strengthens students' memory. So making those links will also mean that students are more likely to remember what you teach them about Iago as well. So it's about kind of helping them retain that information as much as it is kind of teaching them the literary context as well. And obviously, I feel that when you're looking at comparing things, sometimes when you're comparing two things, you notice something in that original thing that you've not seen before. So there are plenty of things when we were comparing Iago to Don John that we noticed about Iago that we hadn't really noticed before because they hadn't been highlighted as much until we did that comparison. So I think it's also quite important then in terms of why we do it, in terms of making links and developing a depth of knowledge, especially about the genre of tragedy and also how Shakespeare crafts his villains. So considering like the interaction between comedy and tragedy, I think is quite important. I think that's partly because when I first taught the course at my old school, I was teaching the comedy side of the spec, and now I'm teaching the tragedy side. And actually, when I was teaching the comedy side, I did teach it very much as just focusing on comedy, kind of staying within that box. Whereas having taught both sides now, I realise kind of that interplay is quite important to understanding how tragedy or how comedy works. So comparing a single villain across the two genres, obviously by the same writer as well, can be quite advantageous to kind of increasing students' depth of knowledge. And then obviously it's helping with that range and depth of literary context as well, thinking about how Shakespeare crafts his villains, how he shapes his villains, and that in turn obviously impacts our interpretations. So when it came to choosing kind of Don John to compare against Iago, I just found it really interesting always like how similar the two characters actually are. So you've got that top quotation there from Iago, and then underneath that quotation from Don John. And I just felt that, like Iago, Don John really, he deals with the fact that he's a villain. He's quite incredibly open about it. And I think that that links a little bit with Coleridge's quotation about Iago's motiveless malignity. And I think you could argue that that could be the same of Don John to an extent as well. He'd rather be that canker than a rose in his Lord's grace. He'd rather be that kind of thorn in his side. So that idea that they're just evil and mean because they enjoy it, I think Don John's very, very open and explicit about that, whereas Iago, obviously he gives us motives, whether or not we believe them and kind of trust those motives is very, very much debatable. But again, I think it's really interesting that both of them explore the concept of a villain themselves within their dialogue, within the plays as well. So I think that gives us another layer of analysis when we're looking at what a villain is and how Shakespeare crafts those characters. So what I thought I would do is just go through the process that I went through for comparing Don John and Iago with my year 13s this year. I've not got any PowerPoint slides that go along with it, partly because we did it as a remote lesson, and all of it was pretty much kind of me and a notebook going through these different stages. I was really keen to kind of build up to that comparison at the end and scaffold for them as we went through it, because I know that I've got some students in there who aren't as high ability and do need that kind of extra scaffolding and support. And I think sometimes that misconception about A-level, that you should just leave them to it, they should just do it independently, can be quite dangerous. I work in a school and in a sixth form where it is incredibly comprehensive. We have students coming in to study literature who are getting grade 5s and occasionally grade 4s at GCSE. We welcome them onto the course because they're on it because they love it and they have a genuine interest. Financially, we also have to welcome them onto the course because otherwise the course wouldn't run. So we do need to make sure that we're kind of supporting those students as well. And I feel that's something that's quite important. So to start off with, we just kind of went through villains within tragedy, mainly through a lot of retrieval practice, focusing on, yes, Iago, but we also had a look at Death of a Salesman and kind of unpicked the potential role of the villain. Obviously, it's not nearly as clear cut in that as well. And then what I did was introduced some of the key threads of comedy. So comedy was something that we hadn't looked at in as much depth up until this point. So we looked at comedy by comparing it with tragedy and also looking at the overlap between the two, especially within Shakespearean plays. If we think about that comedic scene with the porter in Macbeth, or if we think about some of the comedic scenes like with the musicians in Othello, and likewise some of the tragic scenes, if we think about the nature of, say, Hero's death, or mock death, sorry, in Much Ado About Nothing as well. At that point then, I did ask them or suggest to them that they should watch a version of Much Ado About Nothing before we had this lesson, but we did go through an overview of Much Ado together just to make sure that they did kind of understand the plot and that they understood that storyline. We then had a bit of a discussion about why it's my favourite Shakespeare play as well, because I'm an absolute massive fan of Much Ado as well. And then we kind of zoomed in within Much Ado, again, just focusing on Much Ado, on Don John, and looked at a key extract within the play. Obviously, he doesn't kind of have as much of a part to play as Iago. He doesn't say nearly as much as Iago. That in itself is quite an interesting comparison to make between the two structurally. But we looked at Don John in an extract, and we also looked at how Don John kind of disappears at the end of the play and how he's kind of not there physically and he's barely referenced compared to Iago's more kind of central role even at the end, and kind of that ongoing presence. After exploring Don John then, we then moved on to focusing on comparing Iago and Don John. We did a lot of work thinking not just in terms of like their actions within the play and them as villains, but we also looked at some of the linguistic features within their dialogue as well. We've done quite a bit this year in terms of that kind of conversation analysis style skill, kind of trying to bridge the gap between linguistics and English literature as well, which we found really useful. And then at the end, we kind of brought it back, not just to comparing them, but thinking about why we wanted to compare them in the first place, and kind of got the students discussing how comparing Iago and Don John was a fruitful activity and how it kind of impacted our interpretations of Iago, whether it's a case of kind of building that depth of literary knowledge and thinking about the things that Shakespeare purposefully does to create a villain and to structure the play, but also looking at some of those key differences. So, for example, the fact that Iago features a lot more in comparison to Don John. He has those soliloquies with the audience, that relationship with the audience, which obviously builds on those earlier comments, that idea that perhaps Shakespeare wants Iago to be charming. He wants us to kind of have that insight into his mind. He almost wants us on side with Iago, which, again, comparing that to some of the kind of language that he uses and the way that he treats people, in itself is quite a scary thought. And we ended up talking about perhaps Shakespeare trying to use Iago to try and kind of reveal that underlying darkness that lies within humanity. Got very kind of deep and conceptual at that point. So it managed to actually really kind of unearth some really fruitful ideas and fruitful discussions and concepts. So that was obviously really focused on Iago and Don John, and focusing on that role of a villain, and also thinking about how the role of a villain within a comedy is different to a tragedy. But obviously there are quite a few other kind of elements that you could compare as well. And I'm starting to look at kind of a 7-year curriculum across the schools in our trust, looking at how students' knowledge develops and builds from year 7 right through to year 13. We're fortunate enough that we're able to do that. So we're starting to think about which texts we teach earlier on and how we can flag up key themes like villains, and use that as a thread that we continue to follow right until year 13. So some of the other kind of things that have come up, first of all, looking at the comparison of that last scene, so that kind of difference between Romeo and Juliet in the tomb together, kind of dead together and almost in a very macabre but still arguably romantic way together in death, whereas Othello and Desdemona are in a much more romantic setting, but you end up with that kind of pile up of bodies on the bed, and how even in death they're still not allowed to kind of be alone, which is obviously a common theme throughout the play as well. They still don't get that proper moment together, the proper marriage, which again in itself is quite tragic. Also looking at a comparison between Aaron the Moor in Titus and Othello, that was really interesting in terms of unpicking some of the stereotypes that we were unpicking earlier, especially if you think about the difference between the Muslim world and the kind of Muslim stereotypes for Othello versus the kind of the Black African stereotypes that are conveyed through the character of Aaron, and that idea of a lusty Moor stereotype. So that was really interesting in terms of unpicking stereotypes of race at that point in history, and also thinking about the impact of race on our interpretation today. And that was the point when we started talking about that same RSC production with the Black Iago as well. So that was a really interesting comparison to make. And then another favourite one for me is fathers and daughters. Certainly you can kind of bridge that across a range of Shakespeare's plays if we're thinking about Merchant of Venice, Much Ado, and obviously Romeo and Juliet again, and thinking about how Brabantio treats Desdemona, and actually, is that the norm? Would a Shakespearean audience not be that surprised at his treatment of her, especially when you compare to the treatment of other daughters by their fathers across his other plays? Would they actually see it as that horrific? Whereas I'd argue some audiences today would definitely see that as quite horrific. So those are just some of the links. And like I said, I think it's worth considering not just how we link these within the course for kind of developing the knowledge of Othello, but I think it definitely should have an impact on curriculum planning on a wider level. If you are in a setting where you're teaching Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, or maybe even an all through school underneath, it's worth thinking about how you choose the different Shakespeare plays and how they kind of interlink and how you can exploit those threads. By all means, feel free to drop me a message on Twitter if you have any questions, and feel free to kind of let me know if you've got any other ideas. I'm really, really happy to steal and borrow ideas from everyone else as well. And I'm going to leave it there. So thank you ever so much, folks.